Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. We're delighted you're here with us, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's event with Chris Whitaker and Kate Baer. Before we get started this evening, I do have a few housekeeping notes, as always. One, we have tickets available for many exciting events we have planned for this summer, including appearances from Joe Piazza, Hannah Nicole Mayer, and we are almost ready to announce the Harrisburg Book Festival this fall. Please grab an events postcard as you leave and stay tuned to our social media and newsletter so that you never miss an upcoming author appearance or the festival announcement. Second, you all have in your hands a paperback copy of All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker. If you'd like to get your copy signed and personalized afterwards, we will be having a post-event signing in our Rare Books building, which is out these doors to the left, next building over. You may bring one outside book into the signing line. Otherwise, any other copies that you bring into the signing line must be purchased from the bookstore, and we have copies of Chris's books available at the cafe. Thanks in advance for your understanding and support of indies. Now, at this time, I have the honor of introducing our speakers this evening. Our interviewer is Kate Baer. Kate is the 3 times New York Times bestselling author of What Kind of Woman, I Hope This Finds You Well, and Yet. Her work has also been published in The New Yorker, Literary Hub, Huffington Post, and The New York Times. A big thank you to Kate for joining us for this event. A reminder that we have signed copies of all of Kate's books available at the cafe. And if you haven't heard, she is coming out with her new poetry collection, How About Now, which will be released this November, and signed pre-orders are available on our website. Of course, our featured author this evening is Chris Whitaker. Chris is the award-winning author of Tall Oaks, All the Wicked Girls, and the New York Times bestseller We Begin at the End, and he lives in the UK. We're here to discuss Chris's new book, All the Colors of the Dark. It's a New York Times bestseller. Over 1 million copies have been sold, and Patricia Cornwall writes that, quote, All the Colors of the Dark is mesmerizing and intoxicating. Chris Whitaker is a poet who will leave you in breathless awe and suspense. Amazing, haunting, unforgettable. Once again, it's an honor to welcome Chris Whitaker and Kate Baer to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. So without further ado, please join me in giving Chris and Kate a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Thanks.
Oh, it's so lovely to be back here. Before we start, and I always say this before every event, I just want to say that Jeff Bezos doesn't give a shit about authors, but it's places like the Midtown Scholar that make it possible for Chris and I to go on tour. So thank you, Midtown Scholar. Tonight is a first for me. I've never interviewed a man. It's kind of against my brand. It's also a first for me because I've never asked to interview someone, and Alex can corroborate this. I was here a few weeks ago doing an event with a girl who wrote a book about hot dogs, and I said, do you have anyone exciting coming up? And he went through the list, and he said Chris Whitaker, and I basically bullied him into this. So, Chris, I'm so excited to be here. I loved this book.
Thank you so much, and thank you. I can't believe there's so many of you here. And I saw someone with an eye patch as well, which is very cool. Do you know what's really intimidating is Patricia Cornwell saying that I'm a poet when I'm sat here.
I love it. Before we get into this book, I'd like to hear what it's been like to do a paperback tour versus a hardcover tour, because when you go on tour for a hardcover, no one's read the book when it first comes out, but now you've got this room full. Can I just see raising your hands, who's read this book? Okay. So what I would like to hear, what's been the difference between those two audiences, and what do they want to talk about the most?
So at the very beginning, I remember the first event I ever did was in Aspen with Jenna. And I don't know if anyone's ever been to Aspen. It's the most expensive, most beautiful. I thought that, and then I just came from Nantucket this morning, and that's even worse. and then I spent 4th of July in the Hamptons, and so this is like that's the difference, I think. This tour is like really swanky, and along Cape Cod, and like it never feels like work. I don't know how it feels for you, but like the hard work is done on my own for 4 years writing the book, and this is the payoff. I get to come and talk about Patch and Saint, and meet loads of lovely people. So it's been a dream, really. Yeah, and kind of surreal as well. So I did an event at the Bush House in Kennebunkport, and got to meet George Bush and President Bush, and that was really, I know. So I was, so it's really weird because they do like a Secret Service check beforehand, and I thought there's no way I'm going to pass this, because I've been arrested, I reckon, like 5 or 6 times in my life, and somehow I slipped through the net and they let me in. But you go in and there's like, it's this compound, and there's like President Bush's house is the furthest, biggest house, and then the lesser Bushes. That's not a very nice way of saying it. and then you have like 4 other houses for the lesser Bushes, and so I was in a lesser Bush house, and then President Bush just appeared beside me, and shook my hand and said, "Do you want to come and see the house and see my paintings?" And I didn't really, but no, I did. I really did. I really did want to go and see them. He's a really talented artist, and was very funny and very charming.
Yeah. And like kind of a badass, like a little bit.
Yeah.
Or was he just like a nice grandpa?
He was a bit,
Yeah,
he was a bit like that. He had an edge, which I like.
Yeah. I love that. I liked how you casually mentioned Jenna Bush, by the way. Okay, it's been a year since this book came out, and still the characters, I'm just diving in now, still the characters are so clear to me. Patch, Saint, Misty, Sammy, Dr. Toombs. And it reminded me, Jack Antonoff is this big music producer here. Do you know who he is? It doesn't matter. He's a big music producer, songwriter, and he talks about how album is God. He always talks about how it doesn't matter if you have a great single, album is God. And I thought about, bear with me, I have a point. It reminds me kind of, like, character is God. I kept thinking about that in this book, and I think you've talked about this before, how character is such an important part. A lot of times we read a book and we forget it, and 2 days later. And this one, I keep coming back to it because the characters were so strong and so memorable. And so I guess my question here is, can you kind of talk about building character, and if you have a favorite character, and how you got them to be so memorable?
It's a difficult question to answer because I didn't know at the start. I had a very strong visual image. That's how I begin. I see the characters first. Like the book before, I saw Duchess. I saw this small girl wearing a Stetson. She was an outlaw. I had Patch and Saint, an image of this boy born with one eye. His mum tells him he's a pirate to kind of soften the difference between him and the other kids, to make it less of an affliction, because he's self-conscious. And I think that starts off as kind of sweet and endearing, and then he becomes a teenager and should probably drop this persona because it becomes something else, something kind of sadder, and attracts bullies. And so I had Patch, and then I had Saint, and Saint is the best character that I've ever written. I think she's the character that I get most messages about. People really love Saint, and they feel very strongly that she should get her happy ending, and I completely get it, and because I feel that way about her too. So I had these 2 outlines for these characters, and I had an outline for the book, and it was 2 abducted teenagers fall in love in the pitch black basement they're being held in, having never seen each other. The boy escapes, then can't find his way back to the girl. So that was what I had. That was what I gave to my editors like 5 years ago, and that sounds like a mystery. It was kind of set up like a mystery, and then everyone read We Begin at the End. Well, lots of people did. It was my first book that kind of did anything. And people were worried about Duchess afterwards, because we meet the character of Duchess at 13, leave her at 14, and everyone was saying, what happens next? And it was a big question, what happens to these kids that have a difficult start in life? How do they turn out? And I really wanted to answer it, but I knew that it would completely change the book that I was writing, because to answer it, I'd have to follow these 13-year-olds, Patch and Saint, into adulthood. all of a sudden, it doesn't have the pace of a thriller anymore. It's not a mystery. It's someone's life, and I knew it was going to become a book that was probably more about friendship and coming of age and family and first love than it was the actual crime, which is definitely the least interesting thing in the book. So I began writing, and I was really lucky because my editors just gave me complete freedom. The book was supposed to be delivered in 2 years, and I missed the deadline by 2 years. It was they eventually got the book 4 years later, and all that happened was, like, every month or so I would meet my UK editor at the same cafe in London, and he would just check in for 4 years to make sure I was okay and I could get on with this story. And then it was nearly finished, and I didn't want it to finish. And I was like, I didn't have the ending that I needed, and so I was looking at my contract, wondering if I could stop them publishing it. I remember doing that, thinking, how much am I going to owe them? How much trouble am I going to get in because it wasn't finished?
Yeah. I've heard that you also wrote a lot of dialogue to try to get into their minds. Is that true?
I spent the first year writing dialogue. I had all these problems with this book. One, I didn't know if I could write it. When you feel like something's slightly beyond what you're capable of as a writer, I thought this was probably a book 7, not a book 4. It felt too big in scope. And I was going back to the 70s. I wasn't born in the 70s. I was going to Missouri, never been to Missouri. And I needed to get to know these characters. And it was COVID, and the world felt like it was on fire, and it was very noisy, and I had real trouble concentrating. And I wanted Patch and Saint to get to know each other, and for me to get to know them in the same way that I would someone in real life, through asking questions, listening to answers. And so I wrote a series of conversations between the two of them. And I did that for about 7-8 months, and then I brought in some of the other key characters and wrote just scenes of dialogue. And I learnt loads about them, and they learn about each other. Like Patch kind of swaggers into Saint's life. He's got full of bravado. He doesn't really have any reason to swagger, but he does swagger. And Saint is very, fiercely intelligent and inquisitive, and has all these qualities that probably weren't appreciated in the 70s from a girl. So she's learnt to not raise her hand if she knows the answer to a question, because it makes her no more popular. So it was about exploring that between the two of them. And then by the time I began to write the first scenes in year 2, I knew everything about them. I knew exactly what Patch would do if he saw a girl in trouble. I knew he would run straight in there and get himself into so much trouble. And I knew what Saint would do if Patch disappeared, because Saint isn't the same without him. She's not the same Saint. She's kind of not fully formed, and so I knew that she would drop everything and devote everything to finding him, and sacrifice so much along the way.
Have you been to Missouri? Did you go before while you were writing it, and have you been there since?
I didn't. No, so I'd never been to anywhere that I've ever written about. So when I was 21, I booked this holiday with my friend Scott, and we were going to America. We were going to do 3 months traveling around America. So I would have seen all of the places that I would eventually write about. But our first stop was Miami. And I fell in love with the barmaid in our hotel, and so I said to Scott, let's stay in Miami for 3 months, because I'm so in love, and he reluctantly agreed, and we're no longer friends, because he was so upset that I'd ruined his trip of a lifetime around America, that we're not friends anymore, and I didn't marry the barmaid, shockingly. So I would have got to see loads of the US, but I didn't. I did eventually go to Missouri after I'd written the book on tour, but only to St. Louis, and it wasn't the Missouri of the book. It was like huge mansions, and but it was still really special to fly over, and kind of nerve-wracking, because I was going to the place. If someone from outside London wrote London, I would read it with a very critical eye. But the thing I found, particularly, or only really in the US, is there is a kindness towards the characters, and which extends to me, and I'm kind of met with open arms, which doesn't happen in everywhere else around the world.
I'm kind of getting an understanding of why you're worried about the Secret Service after the Miami story. super selfish question, but it's kind of an undertaking to pull off. And you've talked about this, the multi-decade, multi-point of view structure. What new craft muscles did you have to work on to get? It's a very specific way to tell a story, to span such a time period and so many different characters. What was the hardest part? Was it the time? Was it the different points of view?
I think all of it. I think because I don't plan, it really, to write something that spans such a long period of time, you're going to get lost constantly. And I constantly got lost. I made peace with the fact that I would write and burn 10,000 words in a month that would never be used. And I did that so often. And I think I burned through like maybe 300,000 words that got cut to be left with the 130 that remained. Yeah. So it's a huge amount that didn't make it into the book. Yeah. And I think it didn't feel frustrating really, because I thought I could be one of those writers that spends 10 years writing a book easily. Yeah. I could have done that with this book. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to them. But there does come a point where the story is told and what you're doing isn't really helping anymore. Yeah. And I get like that. Like I lie down at night, and if I worry about a sentence, I will lie awake, and then I eventually give up sleeping at about 3 a.m. and go and change the sentence, then go back to bed. Yeah. And I get so obsessed with it, with finding the perfect sentence and making sure everything fits, that I drive myself slightly mad. Like I did in my second book. I never go back to my books and pick them up and look through them because I find it so difficult. I never watched any interview that I've ever done back. Same. I've never read anything like that, because I'll pick it apart. Yeah. But I picked up my second book because I was working in my library, and picked up my second book, read a page, hated it, ripped it out of the book, put it back, and it's that mad. Like, I shouldn't be allowed. I shouldn't be allowed to write. Just some people aren't cut out for it, and I'm one of those people.
Yeah. In several interviews, and we don't have to get into it, but you've kind of talked about your childhood trauma and the urge to take control of your narrative. I'm wondering how those experiences influence the novel's depiction of resilience and also of chosen family, because both of those things are a huge theme throughout.
Yeah, it's been really difficult. So before the book came out, I had sat down with my publicist, with Diana, and we had this big PR meeting, because I had two choices with the book. I could go on tour and go on TV and things like that, and make up a lie about where the book came from, or I could tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And both were really difficult, because I think I will have done about 200 events by the time the year finishes. To stick to a lie convincingly doesn't feel good, and you're very likely to slip up. But to tell the truth meant going, to a part of my childhood that my dad didn't know about, for one. So that was going to be a shock. And my mum is very uncomfortable with. And I chose to tell the truth. And it's been really difficult. So my mum, when I was a kid, for those of you that don't know, my mum and dad divorced. So I had a really strange childhood, because my mum was a Catholic and my dad is an atheist. And so I had this childhood where I went from church on a Sunday to God doesn't exist, like constantly back and forth. I don't know how they ever got married, or why they thought that their marriage would work, with such a difference. And it didn't work, and they got divorced. And then my mum dated lots of men. You know what? I say this line, I try and rewrite it and say it differently, because it never sounds good. Like, loads of men came into my life. And she wouldn't like me saying that, I don't think. And one of them was, I remember, very charismatic, very charming, quite good looking. My grandparents loved him. He was nice to everyone, but when he had been drinking, very horrible to me, and very violent as well. And it started with like a hit around the head and things like that. I was only about 9 at the time. And then when I was 10, he thought I'd done something in the day to annoy him, and I was fast asleep, and he pulled me out of bed and broke my wrist. And there was a snapping sound that I still remember now, and that stopped him, and he kind of panicked, sent me back to my room, and told me to stay there until the morning. And so I had a very long night as a 10-year-old with a broken arm, not able to make any noise. And in the morning, I had to tell my parents I did it playing football, so that's what I did. And I stuck to that lie for, God, I told my dad the truth about 5 years ago. So it was a big part of my life, and also the reason why I wrote the book. And I think afterwards I got into trouble. You know, I stopped going to school after that and stopped sleeping and had endless problems. And it, you know, it's impossible to think that it didn't influence the character of Patch. Because when I was writing the basement scenes, when Patch is held in the basement, it was so difficult. I would stop after an hour because, you know, Patch in the dark in pain, not able to cry out or make any noise, it felt very close to home, but I didn't make that connection until a year into writing. And then, you know, then I began to trace everything good and bad that's happened in my life. And much like Patch does in the book, there is kind of a network in the story. There is a network of decisions. Like, we all have these moments in our lives, like these sliding doors moments, you know, where you walk into a bar and meet someone and you end up marrying them. What if you didn't walk into that bar? Or what if you didn't take the job interview or something like that? And Patch, you know, without spoiling it for the people that haven't read it, you know, he ends up finding out the truth about someone, you know, and a location at the very end of the book. And there is a network of decisions that lead him exactly where he needs to be to finally get closure. And just like, you know, I think that having my arm broken as a 10-year-old has, and you have to bear with me here, has led me exactly here to talk about this book, you know, that has completely changed my life. A book that there is no way I could have written had I not had this happen to me, because I just wouldn't have known what it is to go through that.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Something else I wanted to ask you was, while you were revising this book, were there any plot changes or revisions that were really tough to make, that you didn't want to make? And it's kind of actually building on what you were just talking about, the paths that we take to get somewhere. Were there any revisions you had to make that pained you, that you knew you had to do? Maybe it was, you know, people are kind of unsatisfied with how she kind of ends. Was it that, or was it something else that was difficult to make, but you knew you had to do it to change
it's
a plot
funny
point?
because what is painful at the time,
Yeah.
you know, during the editorial process, you know, lose this, it quickly becomes forgotten, and then you can't imagine the story any other way. Like this book, you know, I never get nervous ever for anything. It's like, you know, like this weird, like my wife would say, she always says it's sociopathic, which is really mean. And but I just don't do it. Like I don't recall ever being nervous, like TV, things like that. I just don't feel it. And then I was nervous for Colours coming out because it was the best I could do. You know, I knew that I couldn't change a single line in the book, and if people didn't like it, I had nothing else to give them, and that makes you feel vulnerable. Because normally, you know, you get a bad review or something, and you think I could have done better. You know, I could have changed something. But this one, it ended up being the book that I dreamed or didn't really think that I could write. And so it was perfect. I got it as close to perfect as I could. But probably, like, it could have been a different book. My US editor was very worried about having a teenage boy held in the dark for 300 days. You know, she said people won't read it, they won't want to read it, it's too traumatic, you have to cut it.
Because it's a boy?
Yeah, because it's a child.
Because we kill off every girl, we rape every girl.
Exactly.
It's always about that. Because it was a boy.
Because because it's a child held in the dark under such conditions for so long, but I knew that in writing it wouldn't be gratuitous in any way. It wasn't going to be that kind of book. I also knew that it was the backbone of the story. You know, Patch forms this bond with Grace, and that can't happen quickly because they wanted to make it a week or like 3 days. And like this is part of a story that, you know, is going to span 27 years. He's going to hunt for this girl. They need this bond, and it has to take time. And it was the only time that I've really dug my heels in. You know, normally I'm not precious about anything with the book. You know, like it's collaborative. There's people that are far more talented than me and far more experienced working on all of the books. But this one, you know, I knew that it had to be, and I knew that readers could take it, and I knew that those scenes would kind of be, some of them are almost funny. You know, Grace is quite funny, and she takes Patch by the hand and she leads him out of there mentally, and you see what she sees. And so I think my editor was worried for nothing. Yeah, clearly.
So much of the writing is, I have this written down, you can read it, is very poetic, and it's stark one minute and poetic the next. And I'm wondering what authors have you read that you return to when you're trying to find your way into the sentence? Like, what are some authors that you read before writing this, or that really inspire you, or that kind of influence this book?
I very recently read A Prayer for Owen Meany, and it became like my favourite book. John Irving is such a gifted story. I was so late to the party. I could have really done with that book when I was writing this. It would have really helped. But John Hart is the one I return to all the time because he kind of changed my life. I was working in the city and was miserable, and I read a book called The Last Child, and it's this beautiful story about a missing person and about a missing child, and he's such a gifted storyteller. And I read an interview that he had been a successful lawyer and one day just quit his job because he wanted to write and do something that made him happy. And so the next day I quit my job because I was working in the city and I was earning a lot of money, and my life was kind of set. And I quit my job and had to sell my house and sell my car to become a writer, and spent 10 years completely broke, like working 3 jobs, missing so much of my kids growing up. So my wife kind of hates John Hart. She blames him, but John Hart is very lovely. He kind of changed my life, and I got to meet him. I was doing an event in Charleston, and I knew that he lived in Charlottesville, and they looked like that far apart on the map. And so I said to my publisher, "Can you send me to John Hart?" And she said, "Oh, it's a 9-hour drive." And they sent a car and sent me to John Hart. And I had this amazing moment where I got to meet him, and then he said, "Oh, I'm in a writers group," and we go out and we have a really boozy lunch. We get really drunk. Yeah. And he said, "It's me and my friend John and this other guy." And I didn't realise and turned up on the day that his friend John is John Grisham. And so, and I love John Grisham. He's so cool. And he managed to work it into the conversation, and it's difficult to work this into the conversation, that he was once voted like the 3rd sexiest man in America or something. And I thought, just to get that in, I believe the conversation was nothing to do with any of that, and he just dropped it in there, Grisham style. Yeah. I really respected it. Yeah.
I love that, Grisham style. Did you always know how the book would end?
I did. So I saw the scene very clearly. I knew exactly where I wanted Patch and Saint to be at the very end of the book. I just didn't know how to get there. Yeah. And I didn't know where that scene would take place, and that's what really killed me, and that's what made me not want them to publish it, because I had this book that I'd written, and it was close to as perfect as I could get it, but the ending had a placeholder location. And we were like about 9 days away from going to print, and that's when I was trying to stop it, because I thought the book's not ready. It will live or die on this ending. And then I was reading this travel guide online. This guy had been to a specific place and seen a bumper sticker, and that completely changed the entire story. I researched it, and for those that have read the book will know what I mean. The book had to end where it ends, in the only place on earth that it could end. Yeah. It was just perfect, and it felt like it was supposed to be. And I'm not a big believer in fate and things like that, but it felt like it was, I really needed it, and it came.
I know people have mentioned how long this book is. I love a long book, as long as it's worth it, and this one is. But I know it started longer. You cut so much. There's also this trick you use. I call it a trick in a good sense, where these tiny chapters. Is this something you knew you wanted to do? Or I'd love to hear about these. I loved that part of it. It felt like it made it easier to get through the long book. I mean, you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
I loved that.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a plan. It wasn't. Okay. It was because I had such a hard time writing the Patch scenes. Okay. I would switch. Yeah. I would write Patch in the basement for an hour, and then I would write Sammy. I would write Patch again, then I would write the prom or the first kiss or Misty or something funnier. And then when I went back, because I write out of order, and when I went back in year 3 to rebuild the book, it was a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, putting the pieces back together. And so I had lots of smaller pieces of writing, and they lent themselves really well to short chapters. Yeah. And I knew that it was going to be a big book. I knew that it was going to span 27 years, so it would probably be around 600 pages. Yeah. And then you have an issue of how do you keep the pace up. And And it works really well for one more chapter before you go to sleep. If the chapter's, only a page or 2 pages, you can keep the pace going, and you can break often. If you are finding it difficult, to read about Patch, you can break. There's a lot of breaks.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for anyone here who is an aspiring writer, specifically a novelist, or any writer?
Do you know what? I'm so unqualified to guide people that very occasionally I will accept an offer to go and do like a guest tutor thing.
Okay.
And when I'm teaching for the hour that I have to do it, I can see the real teacher flinching, like physically wincing at how I'm telling people to write, because it's so bad, and like they will never hit their deadlines. They will never, get anywhere near finishing a book. But the one thing I would say is don't start at the beginning. There's so much pressure on the first page, the first paragraph, first sentence to hook readers in. You can't know the story well enough at that point. You can't know the characters to go in there. So I skip way ahead and I just jump straight in and write a scene that I want to write.
Yeah.
I know lots of writers that look forward to a scene that's coming up and they'll write their way up to it. I go and do it, write it, and then I'll switch and write something else. Same with writer's block. If you're ever stuck, write something that you feel like writing that maybe feels like it doesn't belong in the book, in the story that you're telling, because invariably it does. I wrote so many scenes that I didn't think would ever make it into this book. Just like side scenes with Sane or playing the piano or something like that. And they all made it into the final cut because I think my brain was leading me that way.
I love that. That's great advice. That's $1 million advice, I just want to say. Alex gave me the 5-minute signal, but now I can't find him. Oh, one more, or should we be... One more?
Sure.
This is really quick. I know someone's wants to ask this, so I'm just going to ask it. Will we get to see Patch and Saint on screen?
We will. Yeah, we will for sure. So they're going to make 4 seasons of TV from one book. So it's a huge amount of TV, and I am an exec producer. We were talking about this earlier, which I took to mean that I can do whatever I want.
Yes.
And so what happened is they sent me episode 1 and 2, and I got out this is true as well, I got out my red pen and I crossed out every single line, and I rewrote the entire thing, and it was so beautiful by the end of it. And then I sent it back and they ignored every single thing. But they didn't even acknowledge it. It was like I hadn't even sent it. So, now I know what an exec producer means. Very little. It's kind of difficult because on the one hand, I know it needs to exist in a different form, and I know that TV is very different, and episode 1 needs to probably be full of action, and I questioned why it couldn't be linear, because we meet Patch and Saint when they're older, then we go back in time, and I know now that it's hard to hang a series on the shoulders of 2 child actors. You need some star power to drive it, unless you have a Stranger Things, which was kind of an anomaly. So I'm learning about TV, but I can't remember, I was talking to one of my author friends, and they said that the way that you have to think about the TV adaptation is there is a brick wall. I'm on one side, the producers are on the other. I throw the book over, and they throw a bag of money over, and we go our separate ways. And otherwise it will drive you mad, and I'm starting to learn that.
One more round of applause for Chris and Kate. We're going to open up to questions. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Just a reminder, there's one of me and lots of you, so we'll start in this general area. If you have a question, just raise your hand.
Hey, Chris.
Hi.
We've met before.
Of course. Hi, how are you?
You remember me? So my question is, who, for the adult actors, do you want to play the characters in the show? Or who would you pick, not who's going to play them?
That is such a difficult one because they are my Patch and Saint. They are real people to me. They are not Hollywood actors. But I get people are very interested, and people send me their ideas more than I have my own ideas. So it started off with the guy from The Bear, who I always forget his name. Yeah, people wanted him for Patch. Austin Butler I can see it's Patch. You know, he kind of looks a bit Patch-like. For Saint, I know people that have read the book. Like, there are some famous people that are fans of the book that we're trying to. They are trying to get. I know Daisy Ridley read it and really loved it, and I think she would be a good Saint, and Daisy Edgar Jones as well. Yeah, who would you choose?
I've got the mic.
Okay.
Sorry, my question's actually for Kate. Is that okay, Kate?
Of course.
So my question is, Kate, how do you know when a poem is done and ready to be out into the world?
As a poet, I could answer this one, but I'm going to...
Yeah, it is kind of a vibe check. It gets to a point, and I wonder, I've written a novel and a half, so I don't know if it's the same for novels. None of mine have ever felt done. But at least for poetry, I know there's nothing else I have to give to it. So that's my answer.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
So my question is this. You said that you poured a lot of yourself into Patch. My question is, did you have a saint? Like, when you were going through those things to inspire Patch, who inspired Saint? Was it an amalgam of people, or was it just imagination?
It's a good question. I think I wrote the characters that I needed when I was a kid. Like, I needed a saint, and I didn't have one, and it's difficult now because, you know, like I had a really difficult time writing the book, and I needed a saint, and then my daughter was born, and she has just turned 5 a few days ago, and she is so saint-like. You know, even at that young age, she is the most perfect person that I've ever met, and yeah, she kind of saved me. So I had a really difficult time writing the book. We had a really difficult lockdown. The day before lockdown, took the roof off of my house to do an extension, and then we couldn't get a roof. And so there's a video on my phone of it raining into the house, and my daughter was just born shortly after that, and she is screaming, and I'm trying to collect all the rain in like pans and things and cups, and she got me through that, you know, that difficult bit. And then I was trading in the stock market, which I do every day of my life, because I spent 10 years as a trader, and it kind of gives my life some sort of structure. As a writer, it's kind of hard to have a shape to your day sometimes. And the phone rang, and it was the FCA, who are the financial police in London, and they said they were going to arrest me for stock market manipulation, and I haven't been arrested for ages. You know, like I was having such a good run, yeah. And then they did arrest me, and it was a really strange arrest because I had to go into London to my lawyer's office, and the police arrested me over Zoom on. And like I was like they were reading me my rights, and I very nearly shut the laptop. Or as someone suggested, just freeze, you know, like, and pretend that the connection has gone. And so I was under investigation for like 8 months, and it was really stressful. And my daughter, you know, just focusing on being the best parent I could when it felt like I'd really messed up. That got me through that, and writing Patch and Saint got me through that really difficult time. And eventually they dropped the charges because they couldn't make them stick, which was really cool. Yeah. Not because I didn't do it. No, I didn't feel it was that bad what I'd done. So I got through that, and my daughter, and I was writing Saint throughout that, and Saint is so pure and so, you know, so morally strong and brilliant in every way. And so I could have done with a saint throughout my childhood. It would have been an easier time, I think.
Question to your right on the stairs.
Hi.
Hi, what happened to your neck?
I had surgery 6 weeks ago. I was going to say, I just want attention, apparently. Sorry. Well, I'm not going to ask about all the police and jail time, because clearly that comes from personal experience. No. So in reading the book, the one time where I actually gasped out loud is when Saint reveals she had her child and gave it up.
Some people are putting their hands over their ears.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I'm so very sorry. Suck it up. Sorry. But I was fascinated by it because maybe as a feminist, I found myself thinking, oh, did you just go back on me? Because she's so strong and so feminine. And the fact that she went and she told her husband she had an abortion, he kicks the crud out of her. I'm ruining it for everybody. I'm so very sorry. But she lied. Talk to me about that choice for her character because it's so defining.
I don't want to spoil anything even further. Yeah, it is the paperback tour, you are right. So Saint is complex, and Saint at the very beginning of the book makes a deal with God. And she says, if you bring back Patch, I will live the kind of life that my grandmother wants me to live. And so that decision is part of her. She's kind of confused over what the right thing is to do, but she feels that that is the right thing to do. And she also knows that she doesn't want to stay with Jimmy, and she doesn't want Jimmy to be the father, of her child. And so it comes from a selfless place, I think, that decision. And as tough as it is for her grandmother to take, Saint does the right thing for herself.
Before the next question, I'm sorry, I just want to tell a quick story for anyone who hasn't read the book. When you read it, I want to tell, there's a part that's pretty early on, I would say a quarter of the way in, that's really scary. And I was reading this book on the beach, and I read this part. I've told all my friends this story too. I was reading it, and I read a really scary sentence that you kind of go, and as I was reading it, my 6-year-old had snuck up behind me from his nap and let out just the most blood-curdling scream to scare me. And I threw my book, and it landed right in the water. Anyway, so that is I just wanted to say, when you read that part, I want you to think of that happening.
I just had a quick question about, you said that you start with dialogue to build the characters first. Do you ever end up using that dialogue in the book itself, or is that just for character development?
Most of it made it in, most of the dialogue, but it was kind of changed and edited beyond all recognition. But I remembered where I was when I was writing certain bits of dialogue, and then knew where I had to get to in the story. So I reckon maybe half of it probably made it in, and then about 10% was unchanged. So kind of, yes, but it's a process.
Hi, I just have a question. I was really surprised when I found out you were British. How did you do such a good job at capturing small town America? Like, I just think, I feel like every town has a Sammy, every town has a Saint's grandma, and it just felt really familiar, the town itself.
Research. There's no substitute for it. There's no quick way you can't cut any corners. I spent years working on crafting the town, and I worked in my library, and I loved working in my library. It was like my favorite job that I've ever had. I worked in the library during lockdown, and you couldn't come into the library during lockdown. But it was deemed an essential service in the UK. So you could email in what kind of book you wanted, what genre you wanted, if you wanted a romance, love story, thriller, and whatever you asked for, I would give you my book in return. So, because I would find something and we begin at the end. If you want a love story, it's in there. And so after the library closed, I would stay there and I would sit down and I would immerse myself in the new world that I was building. I had maps and travel guides and fiction, non-fiction, loads of photographs, old newspapers, paintings, everything that I could find. And then I found a website where you can listen to people speak, so you can choose a region and then a town within that region. You can listen to someone read a transcript and you can pick up on speech patterns like that. And I work across 3 screens. It's like a hangover from being a trader, because you have a lot of screens when you're a trader. So on the middle screen is the manuscript. On the left-hand screen is everything that I can see or want to see. And I use the example of Saint taking a walk in the woods in Missouri. I will find loads of photographs of Missouri in the 70s in the woods and cover the screen with them. On the right-hand screen will be everything that Saint can hear and feel and see. It will be what kind of trees are growing, what flowers are growing, what do they smell like, what do the clouds look like, how wet is the ground, will she leave a footprint if she steps down, everything you can think of. And then I overwrite the scene with all of these details, and then I cut the scene because it doesn't need that much detail. I cut it again and again and again until it's a single paragraph that should make you feel like you're standing next to Saint or you're on her shoulder and you can see what she's seeing. And I do that for every scene in the book. And so that's how, yeah.
Question in the back.
I recently led a discussion on this for my town library.
Okay.
And so I read it a second time, and for some reason I decided to circle every time a color was mentioned. And it seems like there's a real color palette. Is that something you chose specifically?
I've never heard of that before. That's really cool. I think partly that's why the title was pulled, because like I had no title for this book, and I've never named one of my books successfully. Like the sales team get involved and the title gets changed and they do research and things like that. And this one I had no title for 4 years. Normally you get to the end of it and you read back through the text and you pull out something. That's how we found We Begin at the End. That was pulled from the text. This one I had nothing. And I remember my UK editor sent me, he had just written All the Colours of the Dark in giant letters and sent it over to me, and it fit in such a perfect way, partly because of that, partly because it's a story about pulling something positive from something that seems overwhelmingly negative. You know, Patch would never have picked up a paintbrush and discovered he was a gifted artist had he not been abducted. You know, art changes his life and gives him hope when he has none. And he's a kid that wouldn't have left the town that he grew up in. All of a sudden, he's traveling around the US and seeing the most amazing things and living this really rich, full life that he doesn't really see because he's so fixated on the destination. He misses the journey, but we see it for him. We see how much he lives. And so it was about, you know, finding something positive, absolutely finding something positive. And I did the same, you know. I was stabbed when I was a teenager. I was mugged. It was really violent. I don't think I would have. I did writing as therapy afterwards. That's how I found my way to writing for PTSD. And I'm definitely someone that wouldn't have written a book, wouldn't have picked up a pen and written a book had I not been stabbed. I don't think I would have been stabbed had I not had my arm broken. There is some method to that madness. I think that if someone pulls out a knife and asks for your phone, any sane person would give their phone. I didn't. I decided to have a fight with the person because I think as a 10-year-old, I didn't like feeling like a victim. You know, I was a powerless 10-year-old. As a 19-year-old, I could fight someone back. Even when I got stabbed, you know, I kept trying to fight him. And it was very, like Patch is very like that, very reckless. You know, so there is a method to it all. And that's where the title comes from.
Question to the left.
Hi. Like everybody here, I loved so much about the book and all of the characters, and I'm in awe of your process. But I also really loved the funny parts. There were a lot of subtle humor in it. And I wonder, I know that you didn't grow up in the 70s, but you definitely seem to have a little inside joke about the movie Grease.
I watched that because this is going to sound like a real sob story, but we had no money when I was a kid. Like my dad left and my mum was working night shifts and things like that. And I found a copy of Grease when I was a kid, and I watched it because it was the only VHS tape that we had. I watched it about 100 times, and like I really wanted to be Danny so badly. You know, he was so cool, and Patch is the most reluctant Danny in the book. And it really made me laugh writing those scenes. And most of the scenes with Patch felt a bit like I was drowning when I was writing them. And then some of them were like coming up for air and taking big gulps of like pure fresh air and writing the Grease scenes and Misty's terrible singing. I really hope that makes it into the TV series, because I really loved writing them.
Hold on, we have a question on the balcony.
Hi. Working on a new book, yes, I am in theory supposed to be writing a new book, but I've been on tour since last June, and I've been in a different country every month, and this, I think, is my 7th US tour since last June, and I come back in September again, then again in October, and so I find it really hard to write. We were talking about this when I'm on tour. I like to shut myself away and write the book, and focus on it. And I like to do that for 3 or 4 years. And I think that time might have gone, when I can clear out that kind of schedule. So I'm learning to go back home, write for a while, go on tour, go back home. It's like wearing 2 different hats. I'm writing a book called The Timekeeper, and it's a big love story that looks at the idea of time and fate, and how much control, if any, we have on those things. And there is a teenage character going through a difficult time, because I write what I know.
We have time for maybe one more question. Anyone?
There's too much pressure on the final question. It has to be a good one.
Hi. I found this book to be kind of a masterclass of relationship building. I was wondering, apart from Saint and Patch, what was your favorite relationship of the book?
That is such a good question. I think maybe I really like the dynamic between Patch and Sammy. Sammy is such a reluctant father figure, but he is such a good father figure and doesn't really see it. And I think Patch sees it. I really love the relationship between Norma and Saint. Norma was a really difficult character to write, because she's so tough and so unforgiving in what she believes. And also that relationship by extension between Norma and Patch is really interesting, because I think Saint believes that Norma doesn't like Patch, but I think that Norma loves Patch but sees him as a threat to her granddaughter being everything that she can be. And that's quite right, because he is. And that was difficult. Jimmy was really so much work on Jimmy. He's such a difficult character. I think most of us can remember those kids that kind of peak at high school. They coast along, and then they get out into the real world and they can't cope, and they fail at something for the first time. And Jimmy can't cope with failing, and he is the weakest kind of man. He doesn't want Satan to succeed at anything because he can't succeed himself. And so writing their relationship was really difficult, but fulfilling, because I think Saint comes out of it. She is even stronger as a person. And so many people message me about Saint, and some people message me about Patch and his treatment of Saint, which I never saw, as I think they think that he is a user in some ways, and I don't see it that way, but it was really interesting.
We give one more round of applause for Chris Whitaker and Kate Baer.
Thanks.
Once again, the book is All the Colors of the Dark, over 1 million copies sold. We're going to have our signing with Chris in the Rare Books building. If you go out those doors to the left, follow those people, they know where they're going. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Have a good night.